All units broadcast for Elizabeth Ann Broderick, who we believe is his ex-wife. We believe she has some information that might bear on this case.
A lawyer, a great lawyer, a doctor, graduated medical school. He's just a wonderful person. And it's just real sad. It's incredible that the number of people that will be hurt, just not just friends, but he's got 4 really wonderful kids.
And what did you do when you went into their bedroom?
Well, the motion that I made, although I don't think it was a big motion, the movement that I made into their bedroom woke them up, and they moved, and somebody screamed, "Call the police," and I said, "No!" And I just fired the gun, and this big noise went off, and then I grabbed the phone and got the hell out of there. But I wasn't even in that room. I mean, it just was an explosion. I moved, they moved, the gun went off, and it was like, ah! And it was that fast.
This is not just a murder case. This is the story of a woman who says she went there to die and ended up killing 2 other people instead. And the evidence around that claim is far more complicated than the conviction suggests. Stay with me. Betty Broderick drove to 1041 Cypress Avenue in the Marston Hills neighborhood, near Balboa Park in San Diego. It was dark outside, just after 5 in the morning. The neighborhood was quiet, nothing moving, no lights on, no neighbors awake, just Betty, alone in a car, with a .38 caliber revolver. She used a key she had taken from one of her daughters to enter the home of her ex-husband and his new wife. Now, stop right there, because that key is going to matter. We are going to come back to that key. And when we do, the story shifts in a way that is genuinely difficult to explain away. She drove to Marston Hills in the early morning. She entered the home, and moments later she crept into the couple's bedroom and shot them to death while they slept. Linda Broderick died instantly. Dan Broderick was shot in the chest, and he died more slowly as his lungs filled up with blood. Before she left the scene, Betty pulled the bedroom phone from the wall so that the couple could not call for help. She then got in her car and drove away. No sirens, no chase, no panic. She drove to her daughter's apartment. Betty Broderick's children were the first people she called to confess to the murders. And here is the detail that I need you to hold on to.
And what did you do when you went into their bedroom?
Well, the motion that I made, although I don't think it was a big motion, the movement that I made into their bedroom woke them up, and they moved, and somebody screamed, "Call the police," and I said, "No!" And I just fired the gun, and this big noise went off, and then I grabbed the phone and got the hell out of there. But I wasn't even in that room. I mean, it just was an explosion. I moved, they moved, the gun went off, and it was like, ah! And it was that fast.
Because this is where the whole case begins to fracture. Kim testified at her mother's trial in the fall of 1990 that her mother did not cry while admitting to her crimes. She also recalled that Betty said she planned on killing herself that night, but had run out of bullets. She ran out of bullets. Let that breathe for a moment. She fired 5 rounds into that bedroom. 2 people are dead, and her explanation for why she is still alive is that she had nothing left to shoot herself with. When asked at a parole hearing why she didn't commit suicide, as she said she'd planned to, Broderick responded, "I didn't have any bullets." Now, here is the question we are sitting with today, and it is not the one most people are asking. The question is not, was Betty Broderick a villain or a victim? That debate has been going on for 35 years. It will go on for 35 more. The question we are sitting with today is this: was the morning of November 5th, 1989, a moment of total psychological collapse? Or was it something else entirely? And what does the physical evidence of that morning, the gun, the key, the phone cord ripped from the wall, the 5 bullets, the silence, actually tell us when you lay it all out flat? Because those 2 things, panic and plan, look very different. And right now, what happened inside that bedroom, in the dark, at 5:30 in the morning. Only one person is still alive to tell us. Before we go deeper, if you are new here, welcome. This channel goes where the evidence leads, not where public opinion points, not where the made-for-TV version ends. We follow the actual record. Stick around. This one is worth your time. Now, let's talk about the day before. Betty admitted she had received a legal notice from Dan's attorney the day before the murders. A letter she found humiliating. It warned her of harsh repercussions, including preventing her from seeing her children, if she continued her harassment of Dan and Linda. One day before, she receives a letter. That is, by her own account, the thing that triggers the visit. Betty told law enforcement she viewed the letter as another example of the years of emotional abuse and provocation that Dan had subjected her to, and that it had prompted her to make that fateful visit to their home. So according to Betty, she did not wake up that morning and decide to kill two people. She woke up that morning crushed under the weight of one more piece of paper, one more legal maneuver, one more move on a board where she felt she had no pieces left. Before the homicide, there had been claims that she was suicidal for some period of time. The defense's theory was that Dan Broderick thought she was going to kill herself. A week before the murders, Betty wrote a letter to her divorce attorney stating, "I can't stand this anymore. Them always insinuating I'm crazy." Betty testified that when she went to Dan and Linda's house on the morning of the murders, she intended to speak with him and then commit suicide, because she had no life left. Now let us be precise here, because precision matters. Betty testified to this version of events.
What did you do at that point?
Well, I was gonna say, Dan, wake up, I have to talk to you.
Did you say something?
I don't know.
Under oath, in open court. That is what she said happened. The prosecution rejected every word of it, and we are going to get to exactly why, and why the physical evidence makes that rejection very difficult to simply accept. But first, let's talk about the gun. Broderick had bought the gun a month before her husband remarried. She practiced shooting. That is a prosecution fact, and it is a significant one. She did not grab a weapon in a moment of rage. She purchased it. She trained with it. She loaded it. A month before Dan and Linda's wedding, and she kept it for 7 months. She bought the gun a month before her husband remarried. She practiced shooting. She made threats, and she took her daughter's key to sneak into a house that, under a restraining order, she was forbidden to enter, according to testimony. Notice this. She was legally barred from being at that address, under a restraining order, and she entered anyway, in the dark, before sunrise, with a loaded weapon, and she used a key she had obtained from her own child, to do it. Dan had obtained a series of restraining orders, and when he and Linda eventually married in April of 1989, Dan, at the advice of worried friends and family, hired additional security, and reportedly wore a bulletproof vest at the nuptials. He wore a bulletproof vest at his own wedding, because of Betty. 7 months later, he was asleep in his bed without one. And here is where the prosecution's case was at its most powerful, and where the defense's case was fighting uphill. Prosecutor Carrie Wells, in closing arguments, described the killings as a double execution, and she pointed to Betty pulling the phone from the wall as showing her intent. Think about the mechanics of that for a second. You fire 5 shots in the dark. 2 people are hit. 1 is already dead. The other is badly wounded. And your next action, before you leave, is to reach over and pull the telephone from the wall. That is not the action of a person in shock. That is not the action of someone who fired the gun out of surprise. That is a deliberate choice made in the seconds after the shooting, to prevent a dying man from calling for help. Dan Broderick was shot in the chest and died more slowly as his lungs filled up with blood. Betty Broderick ripped the telephone extension from the wall so he could not call for help, according to testimony. The defense never disputed the phone cord. Betty herself never denied it. What she said was, "Linda came at me. and the gun went off. She fired out of reaction. She says Linda startled her, and that is when the shooting began. But here is the friction point, and it is a significant one. The first 2 bullets hit the wall. The third and fourth hit Linda in the head and neck, killing her instantly. The 5th bullet hit Dan in the chest. 2 shots into the wall first, 2 shots into Linda, 1 shot into Dan. If she was startled, if the gun went off by accident, why are there 5 rounds? Why are they distributed across 2 separate targets? And why, after all of it, does she reach for the phone cord? Evidence presented at the trial suggested that Dan didn't die instantly, and that he was shot while trying to call for help. Dan Broderick was shot, then tried to reach the phone, then Betty ripped it from the wall, and then she left. By the end of that same day, Betty Broderick had turned herself in, admitting to the shooting, but claiming she had not planned the attack. She walks into a police station, the same day, and she admits it, all of it. Now, for the prosecution, this sequence told one story: cold, calculated, premeditated. Buy the gun, practice, get the key, violate the restraining order, enter before dawn, shoot them in their bed, rip the phone from the wall, leave, turn yourself in. The lead detective on the case, Terry DeGelder of the San Diego Police Department's homicide unit, said, "It was very cold-blooded and calculated." For the defense, that same sequence told a completely different story. A woman so psychologically broken, so legally cornered, so utterly without options, that she drove to that house not to kill, but to end her own life in front of the man who had dismantled it. Defense attorneys argued that Betty was a battered wife driven over the edge by years of psychological abuse at the hands of Dan Broderick, a prominent medical malpractice attorney with money and influence. And the jury, the first jury, could not agree on which story was true. The jury was unable to reach a verdict, resulting in a mistrial. That is not a small thing. 12 people sat with all of the evidence, and they could not unanimously agree that this was murder in the first degree, or murder in the second, or manslaughter, or any single verdict. They were split, hung, done, and that right there tells you something important about the actual complexity of this case, beneath the tabloid version everyone already knows. Now let's go to the piece of evidence that I believe changes everything, and it is not the gun. It is the key. Lee wasn't even allowed to have a key to her father's house, even though she lived there part-time, because Dan didn't want Betty to have access. Read that again slowly. Dan Broderick was so afraid of Betty having access to his home that he refused to give a key to his own daughter, who lived there part of the time. His own child, knocking on the door of her own house, waiting for someone to answer, because of Betty. And yet, Betty had a key. On the morning of November 5th, Betty used a key her daughter Lee had given her and snuck into Dan's home at 5:30 in the morning. Now, whether that key was taken without Lee's knowledge, or whether Lee gave it willingly, matters more than this case ever fully settled. Because if Lee gave that key knowing what her mother intended, the story changes. If Betty took it without Lee knowing, the story changes differently. Lee took the stand for the defense, recounting the frantic phone call she got from her mother that fateful morning. Lee testified. She said, "He said it himself, that one of us was going to have to die." She also said that Betty told her she felt empty and dead inside, and that she was so miserable that she couldn't go on another day. One of us was going to have to die. Betty told her daughter that, after the shooting, on the phone, in a car, somewhere between Cypress Avenue and Lee's apartment. Think about what that means. That sentence is not the sentence of someone who planned a double homicide. It is not trophy language. It is not revenge language. It is the sentence, fractured and raw, of someone trying to explain a collision, an inevitable one, that had been coming for years. But here is the other side of that. And the prosecution made this argument clearly. Betty Broderick said, "One of us was going to have to die." Past tense, after the fact, as a rationale. At her parole hearing, Broderick recalled thinking, "I had one choice, to shoot them or myself. I couldn't let them win. I couldn't let them win." That sentence, right there, that is the one prosecutors circled. Because there is something in that language that sounds less like a woman who snapped and more like a woman who made a choice, even if it was the most irrational, psychologically shattered choice a human being can make. Now, here is the separate the questions frame, and I want you to hold this carefully. Whether Betty Broderick had been psychologically abused, that is one question. Whether that psychological state made her legally incapable of forming intent on the morning of November 5th, that is a completely different question. And right now, only one of those has a definitive legal answer. She was convicted of second-degree murder. Not first, not manslaughter, second degree, which means the jury in the second trial found that she acted with malice, but did not necessarily find proof of premeditation beyond a reasonable doubt at the first-degree level. In the second trial, prosecutors painted a picture of a calculated and vengeful woman who had executed her ex-husband and his new wife in cold blood. Betty's first trial ended in a hung jury. She was convicted of second-degree murder in the second trial in 1991 and sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. The conviction is settled. The legal record is closed on the verdict itself, but what remains open, and what is worth examining now, is what the anatomy of that morning actually reveals. About intent, about psychology, about what the system called murder, and what Betty Broderick always called something else entirely. And the one witness whose testimony sat at the center of both trials, whose words could have collapsed the prosecution's case entirely, was her own daughter. During her first trial, Betty took the stand in her own defense, painting herself as the long-term sufferer of emotional and psychological abuse. Accounts that were supported by her daughter Lee's testimony. Her other daughter Kim discounted that defense, stating that Betty had shown signs of anger and instability long before the murders, and that she believed the shootings were intentional. Two daughters, same mother, same house, same history. Completely opposite testimonies. One says, this was inevitable, a broken woman at the end of her rope. One says, this was a woman who was angry, who had been angry for a very long time, and who made a choice. Kim testified at her mother's trial that her mother did not cry while admitting to her crimes. No tears. Betty Broderick called her daughter on the phone after shooting two people, and she did not cry. She admitted to what she had done. She explained herself, and she did not cry. Now, people process shock differently. That is a fact, and I want to be precise. An absence of tears is not evidence of guilt. Criminal courts have learned that lesson the hard way, over and over. What a person looks like after a trauma is not a reliable indicator of what that trauma meant to them. But the prosecution didn't let it go, and the jury in the second trial didn't either. Does this look like panic, or does this look like a plan being executed? That is the question that has divided people for 35 years. And it is the question we are going to press on, hard, in the second half of this video. Because there is an expert analysis of the physical evidence from this case that reframes the entire morning. And once you hear it, the way you look at every single detail we just covered shifts. But first, there is something that happened a week before the shooting that almost no one talks about, that I believe is the most under-examined piece of this entire case. A week before the murders, Betty wrote a letter to her divorce attorney, stating, "I can't stand this anymore. Them always insinuating I'm crazy." She wrote a letter to her own lawyer. 1 week out. Not to Dan, not to Linda, to her attorney. She was not threatening. She was not planning. she was reporting a psychological state to the one person professionally obligated to listen and to act. And then 7 days later, she drove to Cypress Avenue. What happened in those 7 days? What was the breaking point inside those 7 days? What did she read, hear, decide, or lose that moved her from, "I can't stand this anymore," in a letter to a lawyer, to a loaded gun at 5:30 in the morning? That gap, 7 days, is where this case actually lives, and it is where we are going next. So, let's talk about what the experts actually said, because there were two competing psychological pictures painted at trial, and they could not have been more different from each other. They were not slight variations on the same story. They were direct opposites, built from the same woman, the same history, the same wounds. In the second trial, additional defense witnesses claimed Betty suffered from diminished psychological capacity as a result of emotional trauma. That is the clinical language. Diminished psychological capacity. What that means in plain terms is this. The defense was arguing that Betty was not fully in control of her mind on the morning of November 5th. That what happened was not the product of a plan, it was the product of a collapse. And for that argument to work, the defense needed someone to explain the mechanics of that collapse to a jury in language they could hold. Forensic psychologist Tara Bates-Duford, who is familiar with the Broderick case, has noted that individuals like Dan, who use deceptive and underhanded tactics, often do so to make an individual question himself or herself. Persons under that kind of sustained attack, she says, will feel a loss of control, suspicious about the motives of others, and struggle with increasing self-doubt. Now, I want you to sit with that framing for a moment, because what that describes is not rage, it is erosion. Slow, deliberate, psychological erosion. And there is a meaningful difference between a person who acts from rage and a person who acts from the end of an erosion. Rage is fast. Rage is heat. Rage is something that spikes and burns and passes. Erosion is different. Erosion is what happens when someone has been worn down, so far, so completely, that the floor simply gives way. The defense argued that Betty had reached the floor. On November 5th, Betty's boyfriend before the killings, a prosecution witness named Bradley Wright, testified that she was suicidal. Her defense attorney described slash marks and scarring and had Betty hold out her left arm for the jury to see. Prosecutors refuted the testimony, claiming it was more for show and not evidence of actual suicide attempts. Think about what that means. The prosecution's own witness, a man they called to help convict her, testified that Betty Broderick was suicidal before the murders, not after, before. And then the prosecution turned around and told the jury, don't believe the scars, their performance, their theater. That is the prosecution's case, asking you to believe two things at the same time. That she was calculated enough to plan and execute two murders, and simultaneously not suffering enough for the physical evidence of suffering on her own body to mean anything. The jury in the second trial accepted that argument. The jury rejected the diminished capacity claim, and in December 1991, found Betty guilty of both counts of second-degree murder. But the jury in the first trial, remember, did not. And that division, that hung jury, is the crack in the foundation of this case that nobody wants to look at directly. Mental health experts for the prosecution described how narcissism fueled Betty's inflated self-importance and need to be the center of attention. Experts say that Betty and Dan were caught in a destructive cycle of psychological manipulation. Notice this. Even the prosecution's own mental health experts acknowledged it was a cycle. Not a one-way street, not a villain and a victim with clean, uncomplicated roles. A cycle. Two people pulling each other apart over years. That does not excuse the murders. Nothing excuses the murders. Dan Broderick and Linda Broderick were killed in their sleep by someone who entered their home illegally. That is the law. That is the record. That is what the court found. But a cycle, that word, says something else about this case entirely. It says that what happened on Cypress Avenue was not a random explosion. It was a specific endpoint, on a very specific trajectory, that had been building for a very long time. And here is where I want to bring in the voice that, in my opinion, frames this entire case more precisely than any other. It is not a prosecutor. It is not a defense attorney. It is Betty herself, testifying, under oath, in the second trial. Betty told the New York Times in the fall of 1991, "He took my home, my kids, my money." Then she said, "His was the white-collar way of beating you. If he had hit me with a baseball bat, I could have shown people what he did and made him stop. If he had hit me with a baseball bat." That is not the sentence of someone who doesn't understand consequences. That is the sentence of someone who understood them exactly. Who understood that the system responds to what it can see, and that what was done to her, the legal maneuvering, the financial control, the custody manipulation, left no bruises, no photographs, no medical records that a court could point to. She knew that no one would believe her because there was nothing to show. And that is where this case cracks open into something much larger than Betty Broderick. Because if the system had frameworks then, the way it has them now, for recognizing psychological and financial abuse, does November 5, 1989 happen at all? That is not a defense of what Betty did. It is a question the evidence demands we ask. Now, let's talk about what happened after the trial, because this is where the case shifts from a legal story into something more unsettling. Betty Broderick went to prison in 1991. She served decades. Her first parole denial came on January 21, 2010, followed by another on November 9, 2011, and a third on January 25, 2017. Each board cited her lack of remorse and insight into the murders. At the 2017 hearing, according to Deputy District Attorney Richard Sachs, Broderick was defiant, smirked, and in complete denial. Sachs described her demeanor as defiant, to smirk throughout the hearing, to act in complete denial, and not understand where she is, why she's there, and what happened. Now, the district attorney's office has the right to advocate against parole. That is the process. That is the system, doing what it is designed to do. But I want you to notice something here, because this is the pattern, and it is the part that should make you uncomfortable. Every time Betty Broderick appeared before a parole board, she did not perform remorse in the way the board expected. She did not soften. She did not concede. She did not give them the version of herself that would have made release politically safe. She insisted on her version of events. She insisted on the context. She insisted on the cycle. And the board called that unrepentant. District Attorney Bonnie Dumanis stated, "Elizabeth Broderick remains an unreasonable risk of danger to society." She added that Broderick still has not developed appropriate insight or remorse for these gruesome murders, which she committed with a callous disregard for human suffering. That is the official position, and I am stating it fully, because it deserves to be heard at its strongest. But here is the friction point, and it is a real one. Remorse, as a legal and psychological concept, is complicated. Clinical research on trauma survivors who have committed violence consistently shows that when the original wound is not acknowledged by the system, genuine remorse is extremely difficult to access. Because remorse requires the person to accept full moral responsibility, without context, without qualification. And for someone who genuinely believes the context was the cause, that is psychologically almost impossible. Not because they are cold, because they are still inside the wound. Sachs said that in those hearings, Broderick repeatedly blamed the victims. He recalled she was banging her fist, calling him an SOB, and at one point apologized to his friends by saying, "I'm sorry you lost your drinking buddy." Is that evil, or is that the behavior of a person whose psychological framework never moved past the moment of the crime, never received the treatment needed to process what she had done and why? I am not answering that. I am naming it, because the distinction matters. In a letter she wrote to a local news station in response to a request for an interview, she claimed she was gang raped by the crooked courts, adding that her ex-husband used his power as a lawyer to threaten and intimidate her for years. 30 years later, same language, same posture, same story. That is not the behavior of someone who has processed the event and found peace. That is the behavior of someone who has been re-traumatized, by their own account, by every legal proceeding, every denial, every year inside a system she believes failed her, before the murders and after them. Betty was not eligible for parole again until 2032, when she would have been 84 years old. 84 years old, before she could even ask again. But here is the thing. Here is the development, the actively developing piece of this story that reframes everything we just examined. Betty Broderick never made it to 2032. On April 18, 2026, Betty Broderick was transported from the California Institution for Women to an outside medical facility for a higher level of care. On May 8, 2026, she was pronounced deceased at 3:40 in the morning by a medical doctor who determined the initial cause of death to be natural. She was 78 years old. Her son told reporters that she had been in the ICU off prison grounds with a number of septic infections after taking a fall several weeks earlier, a fall that also resulted in broken ribs. She fell. Inside a prison, she broke her ribs. The infections spread, and she died on a Friday morning in a medical facility outside prison walls, alone. 2 days after her 42nd birthday, she killed 2 people. Just over 3 months before her 79th birthday, she died, having never left prison, having never received a parole vote in her favor, having spent the last years of her life in a cell and then a hospital bed. And now, for the first time in 35 years, the legal story of Betty Broderick is over. There is no next hearing. There is no appeal. There is no parole date. There is no morning where the question of her release gets revisited. The state is closed. But the human question, the one that the trial never actually answered, remains completely open. Notice this. Her children were divided at every stage. Lee and Rhett supported her release. Kim and Daniel opposed it. Her son, Dan Jr., said at a parole hearing, "In my heart, I know my mother is a good person, but along the way she got lost. Releasing a lost person into society could be a dangerous mistake. She got lost. Not she was born evil. Not she was always this. She got lost." That is a son talking about his mother, choosing carefully between love and fear, trying to hold both things at once, the person he knew and the thing she did, and not being able to make them fit together into a single clean sentence. And that is the most honest statement in this entire case. The case both disturbed and divided much of the country. Some saw Betty as a vicious, cold-hearted murderer, while others questioned, and some even sympathized with, her claims of psychological abuse. That divide did not close at sentencing. It did not close at the parole hearings. And it did not close when she died in May of 2026. What is legally concluded is this. Betty Broderick was convicted on 2 counts of second-degree murder. She served that sentence. She died while serving it. The California Department of Corrections confirmed it. The initial cause of death was determined to be from natural causes, and the San Bernardino County coroner conducted the official examination. Dan Broderick and Linda Broderick were killed on November 5, 1989. That verdict has never changed. Those 2 people died in their bed at 5:30 in the morning by someone who loved one of them and resented the other more than the law could contain. What remains open And what I believe will remain open is the question we started this video with. Dan Jr. said his mother got lost along the way. But here is what I keep coming back to. Where exactly did she get lost? At what moment? In what year? Was it the morning she drove to Cypress Avenue? Was it when she bought the gun? Was it when the divorce was finalized? Was it when the affair started? Was it when she first felt that the man she had built a life with was using the law as a weapon against her? And does the moment of getting lost, wherever it was, change anything about what happened on that November morning? You have sat with this evidence for almost 30 minutes. You have heard what the prosecution said, what the defense argued, what the experts found, what the daughters testified to, what the sons tried to hold together. So now I want to ask you directly, when you look at the 7 days between that letter to her attorney and that morning on Cypress Avenue, what do you think happened inside Betty Broderick? What do you think was the actual moment of no return? Because I think that question, right there, is the one this case was never actually built to answer. Courts answer what happened. Courts answer whether the law was broken. They are not designed to answer the question of how someone arrives at the worst morning of their life. And Betty Broderick arrived at that morning. And so did Dan. And so did Linda. Betty had been serving a life sentence following her conviction for the deaths of her ex-husband, prominent San Diego malpractice attorney Daniel T. Broderick III, and the former office assistant he later married, 28-year-old Linda Kolkena Broderick. Linda Kolkena was 28 years old. She died in a bed she had every right to be in, married to a man she had every right to love. Whatever happened between Dan and Betty, Linda was not the system. Linda was not the court. Linda was a 28-year-old woman, asleep at 5:30 in the morning. And she did not wake up. That is where the emotional weight of this case belongs. Not in Betty's story, not in Dan's record, in Linda, who had no part in the years of damage that preceded that morning, and who paid for it completely. Her son Dan Jr. said his mother got lost, and that is true, she did. But Linda Kolkena Broderick never got the chance to get lost at all. She was 28. She had just gotten married. She was at the beginning of something, and then she wasn't. Betty Broderick was pronounced deceased at 3:40 in the morning on May 8, 2026, the same hour, almost, that she pulled that trigger in 1989. She died at 3:40 in the morning, and Linda died just before dawn. That symmetry is not justice. It is not karma. It is not narrative resolution. It is just the strange arithmetic of a story that was always too human for any clean ending. So here is where we leave it, and I want to be precise about what is settled and what is not. What is settled? Betty Broderick was guilty under the law of second-degree murder. 2 lives were taken. The conviction stood for 35 years. She never received parole. She died in custody. That case is closed. What is not settled, and will never be settled now, is whether the system that processed Betty Broderick's divorce, her custody loss, her financial devastation, her psychological disintegration, whether that system bears any responsibility for what it created. Not legal responsibility, not criminal culpability, but moral weight, the kind that doesn't show up in court documents. Whether a jury sees it the same way, no longer applies. There will not be another jury. There will not be another hearing. There is only the record and the question. And the question we started this video with, was the morning of November 5th a total psychological collapse, or was it something else? That question outlives Betty Broderick. It outlives the conviction. It outlives every parole hearing that came and went. Because the answer matters, not for her, not anymore. It matters for the next person sitting in a lawyer's office, being handed a letter designed to humiliate, with a system that speaks fluently in bruises, and has almost nothing to say about the wounds that don't bleed. We will keep following this case as new developments emerge, including the coroner's full determination on cause of death, and any statements from the surviving children in the weeks ahead. If this video made you think about something in a way you haven't before, subscribe, because that is what we do here. We follow the record until there are real answers. And when the record closes, we ask the questions the record left behind. Now, I want to hear from you in the comments. When you look at everything we covered today, the key, the gun, the phone cord, the 7 days, the divided children, the death in a hospital at 3:40 in the morning, what stands out to you most? Tell me below. I read every single one.